Hey, Gray. Just as a note, I am getting over a cold, so this won't be my best recording, but I'll do my best. For most of the 20th century, Eaton's was the most famous store in Canada. It was an iconic national brand, and at its height, 7% of all retail shopping in Canada was done at Eaton's. During the 90s, decades of mismanagement would send the company into bankruptcy. All that remains today is the name of the Eaton Centre, and I wonder how many people walking through it today know the origin of that name. Well, this episode will answer that question. This week on Muddy York, we will be talking about Timothy Eaton, the man who turned a small store on Yonge Street into the most important retail business in Canadian history. I'm Adam Weiser.
And I'm Grayson Miller, and this is Muddy York.
So, Gray, what did you know about Eaton's before we started working on this podcast?
Well, I'd go there as a teen to do some shopping, obviously, at the Eaton Centre, get into some trouble. It was great. But when I was a kid, there was a story called The Hockey Sweater, where a kid from Quebec accidentally receives a Toronto Maple Leaf jersey from the Eaton's catalog, and that's where I learned about the mail order service. So that was interesting, too.
Well, I think there's a lot of people in your boat. For all of its fame, the Eaton name has passed out of the current zeitgeist. Well, here's our chance to make amends for that. Timothy Eaton was born in Clogher, Northern Ireland in March 1834. I'm trying to pronounce that correctly. I apologize if I got it wrong. Now, Clogher is a tiny village, but it's located just outside of Ballymena. And Ballymena is important because it's Liam Neeson's hometown. That's why we know that Timothy had a very particular set of skills. The Eaton family were Scottish Presbyterians who had settled in Ireland 200 years earlier. From Timothy's perspective, the good news was that his family's farm was large by Irish standards and included a very nice 2-story house. The bad news was that he was the youngest of 9 children, and his father had died 2 months before he was born. Timothy was first sent to a local national school. He also spent a short period at a private academy, but he was withdrawn on the advice of the headmaster. We don't know the specific reason why he left school, but he later said that he got little good out of it. And it showed because his spelling would be terrible for the rest of his life. My mother, the literacy teacher, is absolutely horrified by that. Thus, at the age of 13, he was sent to apprentice at a large general store in the town of Port Glennon, where he would work 14-hour days and 6-day weeks. This wasn't considered unusual in those days. We know it was a large store because the owner had 12 transport wagons and 3 riverboats. As such, young Timothy would have become familiar with all kinds of produce and merchandise. The man who owned the store was a distant family relation, but he didn't offer any charity to the Eatons. Timothy's mother had to put up a 100-pound bond that he would complete all 5 years of his apprenticeship, which he did in 1852.
2 years later, he would emigrate to Canada, following 5 of his siblings who had already moved there. He first settled in Georgetown, where his aunt lived, but in 1856, Timothy and his brother James opened their own log cabin store in the hamlet of Kirkton in Huron County. The Eaton Brothers store became the center of the small community, and James Eaton became the local postmaster. One of the problems with running a store in those days was that most rural customers relied on credit. Cash was hard to find in rural Canada, and farmers usually only had money to spend after they had sold their harvest in the fall. Shopkeepers like the Eatons often had to track down customers in order to get them to pay. A depression in the 1850s meant that the Eatons sometimes had to accept farm produce as payment, which usually meant taking a heavy loss since they now had to find someone else to buy it. All merchants of this period hated accepting credit, but Timothy seemed to have developed a special loathing for the practice. In 1860, the Eatons opened a general store in St. Mary's, 10 miles away in Perth. While James was still a partner, Timothy ran the business and it was advertised as the Eaton Store. The ad said the sales would only be for cash, but this was a goal more than a rule. Despite competition, one of the reasons for the success of the store was that Timothy would rigorously cut prices as low as they would go. That sounds like an ad slogan, but it was true. His store had a very small profit margin for individual products and depended on a large quantity of sales to be successful. This is similar to the business model that Walmart uses today. During this period, Timothy would marry Margaret Beatty from Woodstock, and their first 3 children would be born in St. Mary's. Later on, they would describe their time in St. Mary's as the happiest period in their life. But Timothy wasn't content to be a small-time shopkeeper. So, in 1869, he sold the business to his brother and moved his family to Toronto to try to make it in the big city, or the closest thing that Ontario had to a big city. Toronto's population at the time was a bit less than 70,000, so it wasn't quite a world-class city, but that population had grown by 75% in the last 10 years, so it was clearly on the rise.
Timothy's first attempt to set up a wholesaling business flopped, so instead he paid $6,500 to purchase a dry goods store at the southwest corner of Yonge and Queen, where the Bay store is located today. The shop was known as the T. Eaton Company, which is the official name it would have for the next 130 years. This is the shop where he would fully implement his cash-only rule. Eaton's like to promote the idea that it had created this concept, but this rule had already been adopted by some American and European retailers. Eaton's was the first store to make it standard practice in Canada, though. There was a practical reason why this rule became common at this time. Allowing purchases on credit required storekeepers to be able to track down customers for later payment. That might work in a small town, but as cities grew larger, it became completely impractical. If customers didn't pay at the time of purchase, you would probably never see them again. The new Eaton store also insisted on one fixed price that everyone would pay, instead of the haggling that was still normal in most other stores. A year later, the store also announced a new money-back guarantee, allowing customers to return their purchases for a full refund if they were dissatisfied. None of this is unusual today, but in the 1870s, this was cutting-edge business management. Eaton's first couple of years were rough, and his cash-only policy caused problems with some of his suppliers, who now expected prompt payment. In a letter to his brother, Timothy wrote, "You still have the old excuse which I have made use of many times, that we could not get our money unless we sued our customers. Time and time again I said the above. I cannot now say a word as I am selling only for cash."
Despite these issues, the store began turning larger profits. There were several reasons for this success. Timothy continued his policy of trying to sell large quantities of merchandise with relatively small markups. As a result, Eaton's focused on working-class customers, unlike other stores that prioritized wealthier clients who could provide a larger profit with a smaller number of sales. Eaton's staff also began traveling to Europe to buy merchandise directly from manufacturers, cutting out the Canadian wholesalers who had acted as middlemen until then. Finally, there was the man himself. Timothy Eaton was known to have an encyclopedic knowledge about what was happening in the store, especially about what was selling and what wasn't. One person noted, "I have seen Mr. Eaton standing at the end of a counter watching a customer purchase a pair of stockings. When she had gone, he would ask the girl whether the goods would go any more rapidly if he offered it in groups of 2 or 3 pairs at a price reduced. The plan was no sooner conceived and approved by the selling end of the staff than it was applied." From 1870 to 1880, Eaton's sales figures would grow from about $24,000 a year to $155,000. If you had gone to the store at this time, one difference from today that you would have noticed is that most of the goods were kept behind the counters. If you wanted something, you had to ask one of the clerks who would retrieve it for your inspection. Another difference was that much of the stock was thread or fabric rather than finished products because most people at this time still made their own clothes. The store carried cotton, wool, and silk for clothing, as well as household items like drapes, bedding, and blankets. Women could buy gloves, hosiery, corsets, and handkerchiefs. men could purchase shirts, undershirts, ties, and scarves. One whole department was for mourning clothes because Victorian households were expected to wear black for a year after a death in the family.
Unfortunately, while his business was thriving, Timothy's home life during this period was far more tragic. His next 3 children would all die before they reached their first birthday. 2 more sons would be born, but his last child, born in 1882, would die in a drowning accident at the age of 2. During this time, he wrote his brother, "Our little Timothy W. fell asleep in Jesus after 3 days suffering with cold bronchitis took him off. The cloud seems to hang heavily. We are endeavoring to trust in God." During his time in Kirkton, Timothy had converted to Methodism, and he followed its belief that no work should be conducted on the Sabbath. He also began closing his store early on Saturdays to give his staff some time off, but only after the records revealed that relatively few sales were made on Saturday evening. When the store first opened, it had only occupied the main floor of the building. However, by 1880, all 3 floors of the original building were being used, along with a 2-story extension that had been built on Queen Street. So Eaton's began looking for a new building to expand. However, rather than buying a larger building, Timothy simply bought a whole block. In 1882, he paid $41,000 for every building from 190 to 196 Yonge Street, on the modern site of the Eaton Centre. He then spent even more to knock down the existing buildings and replace them with what would become Eaton's flagship store. The new building had plate glass windows, electric lighting, and a fire sprinkler system. All of this stuff was cutting edge in 1883. Most importantly, it had 25,000 square feet of space to sell merchandise. Despite the new technology, Timothy deliberately kept the decor for the new store modest, so that his working-class customers would feel comfortable shopping there. The new store opened in August 1883, but Timothy continued to pay rent for his old location until his lease expired in February of 1884, even though his landlord had offered to release him. The reason was that one of his competitors was planning to move into his old building once he left, so he continued to pay rent for 6 months on an empty building to delay the new shop from opening as long as possible.
Over the next 20 years, Eaton's would purchase adjacent lots to the north, south, and west to allow for the almost continuous expansion of the store. As we mentioned, when it opened in 1883, the store had about 25,000 square feet of selling space. By 1889, it had grown to 120,000 square feet, and by 1896, it was up to 294,000 square feet. All the space was used to house a growing list of products, including books, toys, groceries, household appliances, dishes, kitchenware, bicycles, jewelry, patent medicines, and my personal favorite, capes. Seriously, when was the last time you saw a reasonably priced cape for sale in Toronto? Please tell me.
I find that finding a reasonably priced cape is very hard these days. I mean, it helps on Amazon, but it's a real gap in the market. Any entrepreneurs listening, this is your opportunity.
Eaton's sales figures also expanded dramatically. You may remember that in 1880, Eaton's was selling $150,000 worth of merchandise annually. By 1895, it was selling $244,000 a month. The closest competitor, at Simpson's, sold less than half as much. 1884 saw the introduction of the Eaton's mail order catalog, which I mentioned earlier. This became a Canadian institution. Remember, most of Canada was still rural. At best, farmers or ranchers would have access to the kind of small general store that the Eatons used to run, but even that was often miles away. The Eaton's catalog suddenly gave these people access to hundreds of different products that had only been available in large cities until then. The first catalog was given to the out-of-towners visiting during the X, who took it home and showed it to their neighbors. The store was a bit surprised by the immediate success of the catalog because only one woman had been assigned to handle mail orders. She would quickly be given assistance. By 1903, the mail order department had grown so much that it got its own building. The early catalogs focused on clothing and fabrics, but later editions would include furniture, cooking appliances like ovens and stoves, farm equipment like milking machines, and even prefabricated houses. The catalog was known as the Homesteader's Bible, and its arrival was a big deal in many communities. While there were formal order forms, lots of people preferred to write personal letters explaining what they had wanted. When a postal strike stopped the incoming letters, clerks noted that they had missed the letters from people, often the chatty one from the maritime provinces. People would also write thank you letters to Mr. Eaton, and there is also at least one documented case of a woman who sent a basket of plums as a thank you to Mr. Eaton.
Around this time, a dispute with one of his clothing suppliers inspired Timothy to start manufacturing his own products for sale. He started with a dozen sewing machines on the top floor of the store. However, by the turn of the 20th century, Eaton's would employ hundreds of laborers, usually immigrant women, who worked at the sewing machines making ready-to-wear clothing for the store. This would lead to claims that Eaton's was running sweatshops and a series of major strikes further down the road. But that's a story for a future episode. Timothy had a very modest social life, and his activities outside of the store were mostly limited to his regular church attendance. In 1888, the Eaton family moved into a large mansion in the annex. This mansion was unfortunately torn down, although you can find a photograph on our Facebook and Twitter pages. However, the house owned by his son Edward still exists and is occupied by the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity at U of T. I can't decide if that's a sad fate for an old home or a great one.
Speaking of Edward Eaton, as Timothy's oldest son, he was their heir apparent and helped his father to run the store. He shared his father's obsession with efficiency and solicited ideas from employees about new practices that the store could adopt. He also chose the famous blue, red, and white colors for the store's brand. However, he became increasingly sick during the 1890s and would eventually die from a kidney problem known as Bright's disease in 1900. His younger brother John would succeed him in his role at the store and his role as the heir. Although Timothy would remain president of the company until his death, John quickly had to assume a greater leadership role because his father was having health problems of his own. A carriage accident in 1899 resulted in a broken hip, and a second accident left him confined to a wheelchair. Timothy also became more rigid and austere as he aged. He would condemn employees for minor mistakes, and one person commented that he preferred speaking to John because you could do it without quaking in your boots. John Eaton also pushed for his father to open a second store in Winnipeg. The city had been growing rapidly, and Manitobans didn't have to depend on mail-order purchases anymore. The store opened in 1905. 10 years later, its sales had quintupled, and 3 new stories had been added to create extra space for merchandise.
Timothy Eaton died of pneumonia on January 31st, 1907. All Eaton's operations were closed for the next 3 days. The Globe wrote, "There is hardly a man in Canada, in fact so well known to the people at large as that of Mr. Timothy Eaton. By no one has the ideal of the departmental store been brought to greater perfection." For people of our parents' generation, Eaton was one of the most famous names in Canada. However, much of Timothy's legacy has disappeared over the last 50 years. I'm sure there's a moral in there about the fleeting nature of riches and fame. John Eaton would successfully manage the company after Timothy's death. However, Timothy's great-grandchildren would run the company into the ground. It declared bankruptcy in 1999. The Eaton Centre is one of the few reminders of what used to be. A life-size statue of Timothy that originally stood in the Eaton's flagship store can be seen at the ROM. There is also the Timothy Eaton Memorial Church on St. Clair, built on land donated by the Eaton family. And finally, Eatonia, Saskatchewan, a town of 449 near the Alberta border, was also named after Timothy. Someday in the future, one of your grandchildren will ask about a company that they'd read about in their school hollow book, something called Amazon. You'll tell them that there was a time when it was the most important store in the world, where you could buy almost anything and have it delivered right to your front door, and they'll stare at you like you're a million years old because they have matter replicators that can produce anything as soon as they buy it. On that day, you'll know how our parents feel when they talk about Eatons.
Well, guys, that's our episode for today. Thank you so much for sticking around and listening to this great story about Timothy Eaton's, one of the most important retailers in our country's history. Adam, where can the good people find us if they want to reach out?
Please get in touch with us if you're interested. Our email address is muddy_york@outlook.com. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook. At some point, I'm actually going to remember these. You can find us on Twitter at Toronto_history or on Facebook at Muddy York History, all one word. And as a personal request, please leave a review or a rating, no matter what it is. The algorithms that decide whether or not people see this podcast depend on ratings and they depend on reviews. So please tell us what you think. Our next episode will actually be a repost of an earlier episode about Hurricane Hazel. That's because the 70th anniversary of this major event will be taking place, so that will be up in 2 weeks. A little bit after that, we'll have a bonus episode about a fun little topic, and we'll be back with brand new content at the beginning of November. So, we'll see you then.